Retro Future.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bonsard of Radio Retro Future, and today we're gonna talk about something of a sensitive topic, and a matter of fact, it's a video that I never hoped to make, but here we are, as I'm preparing a video about a character in which colonial history is of great significance. I feel the need that I need to talk about it in a separate video, so I can keep the other video on point. And I want to share some of my observations on the overall treatment of colonial subjects in fiction, especially in the fantastical genre. So, for transparency, my interest in colonial history comes from the fact that, as some folks who have read Bound for the Sticks might have guessed, my family has ties to Indonesia, so I grew up in an environment that was a bit different from most Dutch families. And it isn't helped by the fact that in the current year, having a discussion about colonialism is nearly impossible, as the subject is often regarded through the lens of who's to blame. And despite all the bluster about colonialism, actual curiosity about historical events and the developments leading up to them is sorely lacking, and writers are no exception. So, in this video I want to address a few misapprehensions that audiences and would-be writers alike have about the past, and some things that any author might want to consider before... well, let's just get into it. For my first observation, I was thinking about making some snappy remark that the knowledge of the average writer is based on activist slogans and TikTok videos, but the real problem is an utter lack of education on the topic. A wiser man once said you can't blame people for ignorance. However, as I stated at the start, it's very obvious to me that most have not even taken a superficial glance at the subject of colonization, and this is a widespread issue that it proliferates throughout all of society. How widespread, you ask? Well, in May 2023, the Skeptical Research Center released a report on skeptic.com titled, "Are White People Morally Deviant?" Don't you just love the internet? Anyway, the link is in the description. According to their report, they interviewed 314 people about the following topic. Given the strong opinions in this report, we ask, what does the public really think about the apparent immorality of white people? They asked their participants to give their opinion on the following statement. Prior to the arrival of European settlers, Native American indigenous tribes lived in peace and harmony. Now, even at the most superficial glance, this is obviously a false statement, at least to me. But among the graduates and people with professional degrees, 1 in 2 agreed with the statement to some degree. Considering the state of the American higher education system, I can't say I'm all that surprised, but what did surprise me was the same goes for moderate and strongly conservative participants. Now, you may ask, did I really have to bring up the current day? Unfortunately, I do, because writers who proposed story ideas to me about this very subject view the whole colonial history through this lens. For example, Radio Retro Future, how realistic would it be for the civilization that avoided colonization or fought against it not to become a colonial power itself? And it just makes you wonder, how do people think that nations are created in the first place? The Netherlands was once settled by the Celtic and Germanic tribes. They were subjugated by the Romans, who 500 years later were subjugated by the Visigoths. Then we had the Franks, the Frisians and the Saxons, who in turn became the first people to be called the Dutch and the Flemish. Those identities were formed over generations and countless wars. For that reason, state built forts, cities with walls. Weapons had to be developed to take these settlements, but until modern artillery was invented, a modern city could take years to conquer with state-of-the-art technology. This led to a stalemate in Europe between rival kingdoms. In order to grow without too much resistance, they had to innovate and find ways to gather gold and resources in other parts of the world. This motivated them to leave the European confines. In other continents we see somewhat similar developments, however their geography forced these cultures in other directions. The Mongols lived nomadic lives on the arid steppes as herders. The Chinese were locked in by the sea on one side, desert and mountains on the others. Their dependence on rice farming and irrigation forced them to adopt the autocratic system that they have to this day. In South America and Egypt, the lack of farmable land helped shape similar styles of authoritarian government in order to ensure their food supply. These economic and political differences determined how the would-be colonial powers interacted with these cultures. Current-day fiction authors who have proposed their ideas on my channel and Discord seem to be oblivious to the complexities of such interactions. Although they want to write stories about colonial history, they seem to have little or no interest in the topic itself. They stick to what they know, and what they know comes from pop culture. And this leads to, shall we say, water condescending claims about European cultures of the past. For example, I'm writing a steampunk novel about the unpleasant realities mentioned in a video, and much of the plot takes place in the colonies from the POV of the colonized. I planned for some civilizations to fight back, utilizing the colonizers' tech against them. How realistic would that be? And this is just a sample of similar statements that I received. The idea that the colonized never used Western technology or had developed technologies themselves. I mean, where to honestly begin with this one? In the current year, when we say colony, we usually mean overseas territories, particularly European-held territories in Africa, America, and Asia. Of course, this perspective suffers from a severe case of contemporaries or presentism. Humans everywhere around the globe have been colonizing territories from the time we were still monkeys. The difference is the worst they had to contend with in those early days were predators. But as humanity flourished and spread, tribes started to infringe on each other's territory, which probably led to the first armed conflicts. As a matter of fact, one Ice Age celebrity, Otzi, might have been killed during just one such event. The most ancient battlefield discovered thus far is in the Talens Valley of North Germany. In 1969, the first mass grave was discovered, and since then the remains of an estimated 4,000 people have been located. We don't know the reason, but it's believed to have taken place in the 13th century BC, an era also known as the Dark Age. You may have heard of the mysterious sea peoples who 3,300 years ago threatened every major empire in the Mediterranean, including Egypt. For those not familiar, this area must have been cataclysmic, because nearly every empire in Mesopotamia was destroyed by a group only known as the Sea Peoples. We have hypotheses about some of these groups because Ramses II had made some depictions of them in his famous victory stele. But these people, and those in the Talens Valley, were likely driven from their lands and looked for new lands to colonize. At least that is the assumption, because we just don't know. The point is that we have evidence of violent invasions from millennia ago. Some colonization was peaceful, like merchants building outposts among trade routes in the Mediterranean, or farmers cultivating fertile areas. The Dutch made their own land out of swamps before recorded history, and the Maya built their settlements on lakes and used irrigation to turn rugged terrain into fertile fields. Jumping ahead to the 15th century, some crazy Italian realized he could sail across the pond, and soon after, the Spanish and Portuguese started a bloody conquest of South America. Then they used the enslaved population to mine resources and work on the plantations to grow food. A century later, the English thought they could repeat that strategy and set out to start the settlement of Roanoke. That failed miserably because, well, North American tribes were mostly nomads and the population was sparse, so no slaves for plantations, no food, and no colony. So the North American settlers had to start smaller and often traded with the native tribes. Well, at first. Well, let's go back to the Spanish conquest for a moment. Did you know that Cortés had only 500 soldiers and 16 cannons at his command when he set sail for Yucatan? As the story is often told, it insinuates that that was all he had, but no, he made local allies, particularly the Tecaltecs and the Texocans. But from a modern day perspective, we would ask, why would these kingdoms help the Spanish invaders? Yeah, about that peace and harmony thing. Due to a lack of knowledge of the past and our modern frame of reference, we project our present society on history. Thus, past kingdoms are treated as modern countries instead of a complex tapestry of local political, ethnic, and cultural entities that happen to be united under a supreme ruler. The sphere of influence shrunk and grew, but from a modern perspective, instead of the 7th century Indian subcontinent being a tapestry of cultures, tribes, etc., India gets treated as if it was a homogeneous country that happens to have some minorities like Sikhs and Muslims, because that is how we perceive our own society. Now, India is the biggest democracy. However, unlike European countries, India is not a nation state. The 550 representatives in parliament have to represent 2,000 ethnic groups speaking a variation of 4 different languages. And people make similar assumptions about Yucatan. I mean, all those people lived in the same area, so they must have been the same people. But no, the South American empires were doing a whole lot of colonizing before the Europeans landed, and many civilizations were already destroyed in bloody wars. Suffice to say, the locals had no issues with destroying the Aztec empires. They were seen as the big bullies of Mesoamerica. In Asia, the colonization started more peacefully. Trade with the Orient predated the Roman Empire, but land travel, like across the Silk routes, was slow and dangerous. So the Europeans looked for sea routes. Eventually, they settled the Horn of Africa and traded for ivory and slaves with kingdoms like Bakongo, Ashanti, and Dahomey. In South Asia, the British and the Dutch set up trade posts to trade with local populations. Now there is a big difference between what happened in Africa and Asia. In Africa, kings waged war with other tribes to enslave them and sell them to Europeans and Arabs. The Europeans then used those slaves on plantations to make money. Now, you'd think the African rulers would do something similar, but no. Instead of copying what the Westerners did in America, Jamaica, etc., all they wanted from the Europeans was gold and firearms so they could wage war, sell more slaves for more profit. This was so lucrative for places like Bakonga, they really didn't even think about making changes. This wasn't because in Africa it wasn't possible to build plantations. This is exactly what black American colonists did in Liberia in the 19th century. During the wars with local tribes, the black settlers used prisoners as slaves in their own plantations in, well, Mississippi in Africa. Yes, that's the name of a province there. But the local kingdoms, like Bakonga, wouldn't even adopt the wheel, despite having streets in their cities. After all, their products could walk themselves. In Asia, European merchants sold firearms, which the local rulers then used to fight each other. Eventually, local Maharajas would hire Western mercenaries, cannoneers in particular, to fight in their wars. The British Empire, in the meantime, collected taxes on these imports and exports. But then they decided to cut out the middleman and go into business for themselves, and thus in 1600 the British East Indian Company was created, a state-owned enterprise led by bureaucrats, but without oversight from the crown, as they could do what they please. And thus they ended up running a rather disastrous administration of Bengal, because they had all these overzealous military campaigns, but no apparent goal. At first they did business with local empires, however, their European enemies were there as well. Together with Dutch allies, the company conquered Spanish and Portuguese strongholds, thus expanding their properties. But then the Dutch and the English became enemies, and then these conflicts got the local Maharajas involved, and what followed was a complex shifting of alliances between European and Indian powers. But not all acquisitions were violent. In 1668, the company signed a lease for Bombay. Under their control, that city grew exponentially and soon became a target for both the colonial and local rivals. In 1690, the English stronghold of Bombay was conquered by the Mongol Empire, and it would change hands various times before the British reclaimed it in 1775. But despite all the wars and violence, Bombay flourished into a bustling city and stands to this day. Suffice to say that the methods of colonization can vary wildly. In America, they built communities from scratch and farmed previously unused lands. In Asia, they traded with local rulers who wished to use European weapons in their own wars. But in Africa, African rulers, with some exceptions, made that much money off the slave trade like Bohomie and Bakonga, They barely developed their economies. As a result, these kingdoms became stagnant, relying purely on capturing and selling slaves. But then disaster struck. The British Empire became abolitionist. And I don't mean they put up some signs. They got the British Navy involved. And in 1807, Britannia made slavery in all its forms illegal. But before I continue, allow me to use this moment for a channel announcement. If you want to learn a bit more about the anti-slavery patrols, I expose some of the history in my novel, The Wrench in the Machine. I write steampunk because I love both history and science fiction. For the longest time I wanted to make history videos, and I finally think I got my angle, but I want to include as much original art as I can. Be aware that all the money I currently make on books and other revenue goes to my artists. Now, you might be curious about my books or be looking for a series with a lot of lore to sink your teeth into. The Association of Ishtar is just such a series, and currently I'm releasing my new short stories on REAM. I release weekly short stories on REAM, but people who become members also get access to published books and even pre-releases. So become a follower on REAM today, and if you want to help out or check out my ebooks, become a member. You can also get my books and merch on our own personal website. All links are in the description. Many moons ago, when I was a student, I remember asking my professor why the slave trade ended, and he gave a kind of meandering answer that it was an indirect result of the American Civil War. But no, it was the British and their African allies who engaged in a long crusade. Over a period of 50 years, the British West Africa Squadron liberated 150,000 slaves from slave traders bound for the United States, Jamaica and Brazil. With all that talk about the history of slavery, why does nobody learn about this? But before I answer that, I hope that, if anything, you now understand the complexity of colonial history and that its legacy deserves more than fictional novels intended to satisfy the biases of current-day audiences. But there was something else that bothered me. Why do Westerners today embrace these narratives so eagerly? First of all, this perspective gives us a clear perpetrator and victimhood narrative. And, well, we know who to blame and, well, who's the victim. And you might say, what's wrong with that? Well, actually, as a matter of fact, there's a lot wrong with it. Pondering on this question of why people are so attracted to this narrative, by some strange coincidence, I found this book in my collection. It's a Dutch textbook from the 1970s called The Great Revolutions. And browsing the index and some of the pages, something stood out to me. The chapters make mentions of wars and technologies and oppression. And the colonial territories only get mentioned in the context of conquest and revolt. The war against slavery, however, isn't even mentioned in the footnotes, unlike the American Civil War, which covers an entire chapter. Then it dawned on me. Apart from the revolts against their oppressors, these native peoples are not shown to have any agency. This book, and many like it, depict non-Western people as passive civilizations who don't have any agency of their own. Their empires and conflicts barely get any mention. The empires they're built, the achievements, the conflict with, and victories over European powers are not even worth a mention, and yet the Seppo Rebellion of 1857, instigated by the ban on widow burning and increased taxes, has a segment. Not being allowed to throw your mother-in-law in open fire was apparently a step too far. But rulers like Tipu Sultan, the Mysore Tiger who allied with Napoleon in a war against the British, has no mention, because God forbid Indian nations are depicted as anything but victims. Now, I grew up with a comic from zero to present. It's a 5-part comic series about Dutch history, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to get into Dutch history. Unfortunately, I could only find Dutch versions, but its creators did an excellent job portraying our national history to a young audience that's both funny and pretty accurate, but it's also guilty of portraying history from this narrative. But I don't want to be too hard on them, but there is this one image of an African chief or king selling slaves to Dutch traders. In the pile at his feet it shows a bag of beads, guns and a chest of mirrors. And the merchant says, "Great! Now make war on the other tribes and turn them into slaves." This image summarizes my issue with how colonial history is perceived. Let's start with the environment. The Africans are shown to live in mud huts, despite coastal kingdoms having built cities with palaces, streets and gardens. The earth walls of Benin are considered to have been one of the biggest man-made structures in the world. And instead of gold they accept beads and mirrors as payments, as if they are children in adult bodies who don't understand the basics of economics. Despite all the talk of racism on the internet, the idea of Native Americans being primitive, naive fools who were easily subjugated by the powerful and technological advanced Europeans is widespread. But most offensive to me is that the king is taking orders from a white man, as if the idea of war for profit is an alien concept to them. Not to mention the logistics that these kingdoms created for trade in human beings. I cannot imagine a better visualization of the idea that the African kingdoms in particular were run by children seduced with trinkets. According to this lens, Western cultures are the driving force behind anything in the world. This would explain titles such as "Are White People Morally Deviant?" because from this perspective, only the morality of white people matter. This might seem trivial, but in the current year, many people believe that it was only white people during the 17th and 19th century who traded in slaves. So let me ask you, where do they get these ideas from? It's a dubious sleight of hand in which the slave traders of Africa, including the caliphates, are purged of all responsibility. But also their accomplishments. India, Indonesia and Africa are treated as single countries and not as extensive tapestries of tribes, cultures and political entities. And worst of all, modern conflicts are treated as little more as post-colonial fallout, and not the result of failed governments like Bakanga and ancient tribal vendettas that predated the Europeans' arrival. So, if you are right in considering writing alternate history or steampunk, there is something to take away from this video. First of all, if you want to write stories about fantasy kingdoms set in Africa or Asia, just write fantasy worlds. 2. If you want to write alternate histories, researching the histories, myths and cultures will offer you plenty of inspiration. Unfortunately, there is little of it. One reason is that few cultures adopted writing, so all we know is based on descriptions by Europeans and Arabs. And the other is that for many countries, the scars of slavery run deep. After slavery was abolished, once powerful kingdoms crumbled, and the tribes they preyed upon turned on them with a vengeance. What was built got destroyed, and their history along with it. Many tribes don't enjoy talking about their history now because it's a shame of their ancestors. And authoritarian dictators don't like foreigners piecing together the little information together of those dark events for that very reason. So ask yourself, why do you want to write about the colonial past? And why is steampunk, or any other genre for that matter, the right one to do it? I have to save the last question for another video, as for the topic of slavery and anti-slavery patrols, I will do a video on that as well, I hope, in the future. I don't really have a final statement, I just wanted to share some of my insights in this topic and how I see it's being treated by creators and in the media. As for this video, I hope you learned something, or at least you have something to consider. I try to do the topic justice and I hope to be as specific in my examples as possible. It's a topic I discuss from time to time with my illustrator Johan Alexander, who is from Indonesia, and together we work on a comic that I'm taking to Kickstarter called Journey to Elysium. He actually works on his own comic, Jaka Mechanic, that takes place in the Dutch Indies and addresses the relationship between the native elite and the colonial government. Links in the description. Finally, if you want this video as a blog, you can go to my REAM or subscribe to a newsletter on associationofhistory.com. And with that being said, as always, make things your way. Good night.